Lecture 8, Barbarians at the Gate.
Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we concluded our examination of the life and thought of St. Augustine, and we saw how, during his lifetime, barbarians had re-entered the Roman Empire. The Goths had sacked the city of Rome in 410, which helped to prompt Augustine to write his magnificent City of God. And on his deathbed, Augustine was faced with the prospect of a barbarian takeover of the city of Hippo itself. A barbarian group known as the Vandals were besieging the town. When last we left the barbarians, though, they were outside the Roman Empire, where Diocletian had kicked them. And so in this lecture, we're going to return to the issue of barbarian-Roman relations, and we will see how barbarians re-enter the Roman Empire beginning in 376, and how this time the barbarians are here to stay, as the Romans are incapable of kicking them out again, and how the incursion of the barbarians would ultimately lead to the deposing of the last Roman emperor in the West in 476 AD. In 376, the Goths appeared along the Danube River frontier and petitioned the emperor of the eastern half of the empire, whose name was Valens, asking for permission to cross the Danube River and enter the empire. Often we speak of the Goths as a barbarian tribe, but technically that's not correct. The Goths and other tribes whom I'll be speaking about, the Vandals, the Franks, for example, are really collections of different tribes. A tribe is a group of people who claim common descent from a single ancestor, whether real or mythical. And all of the Goths do not claim descent from one individual. Rather, they're a confederation, a frequently shifting, always changing confederation of different tribes who really think of themselves as Goths only after they come into contact with the Romans, and the Romans affix this label to them. The Goths originally came from northern Poland, although the Romans believed they hailed from Scandinavia. Recent archaeological excavations suggest that they did not come from Scandinavia. And they resided in northern Poland until about 100 AD, at which point they began to migrate southward toward the Black Sea, where the weather was much more pleasant and the farmland more fertile. They reached the Black Sea about 250, and at that point were very close to the boundaries of the Roman Empire, which helps to explain their raids of the Roman Empire in the 250s and 260s and 270s. But following the accession of Diocletian and his restoration of the Roman frontiers, relations between the Goths and the Romans had been relatively peaceful. There was always the occasional punch-up, but for the most part, the two groups were relatively happy to coexist with one another, as long as the Danube River separated them. For more than a century before 376, the Goths had been exposed to Roman culture in various ways and had come to appreciate that culture. We know that the Romans traded with the Goths who lived across the Danube River because we found plenty of empty Roman wine jugs in Gothic territory. Either the Romans were hurling their empties across the width of the Danube, or the Goths were learning to like drinking wine. We found a fair number of Roman coins on the Gothic side of the Danube River as well. And we know that on occasion the Romans would recruit soldiers from among the Goths, hiring mercenaries who would serve as far away as Syria and Palestine. Another sign of Roman influence on the Goths, even before the Goths enter the empire in 376, is the fact that there are some Christians among the Goths. There were not many Christians yet. The Goths are still predominantly a pagan group in 376, but you could find a handful of Christians. For example, there was one Goth named Ulfila, who was in fact a descendant of Romans captured in the raids of the 3rd century, who had nonetheless become Gothic by ethnicity. Ulfila was, as a Christian Goth, dispatched by the barbarians as an ambassador to Constantinople, and there, around 340, he's consecrated as a Christian bishop and charged with ministering to those Christians who are living among the Goths. Ulfila even translated the Bible into the Gothic language, although he only won a few new converts among the Goths upon his return to them. When the Goths politely ask for permission to enter the Roman Empire in 376, therefore they are not an entirely alien group. There's more than a century of coexistence between Romans and Goths behind this request. And they are not coming as invaders. They are coming as migrators. The Goths' intention is not to take over the Roman Empire. What drives them to ask for permission to cross the Danube River and enter the Roman Empire is fear of the Huns. Huns were Central Asian nomads who had been moving westward for some time and had been placing a great deal of military pressure on the Goths. And the Goths wanted to put the Danube River between themselves and the Huns. In a sense, the Goths are refugees in 376, seeking the protection of the Roman Empire. Why would the Romans allow the Goths to enter, though? Well, in some respects, the Romans had every reason not to allow the Goths to enter in 376, because for all of the wine jugs and coins that you can find in the Gothic territories across the Danube, the Goths were still different. They were still Germanic barbarians, and in many respects, unlike the Romans. To a Roman, the Goths and all Germanic barbarians looked funny, smelled funny, sounded funny. They looked funny in part because their clothing was odd. It was heavy and bulky. They had not lost their Polish roots. They tended to wear heavy furs. And they wore clothing that was sewn and fitted, such as these trousers that I'm wearing right now. The barbarian legacy to Europe is mostly trousers. To Romans, who preferred loose clothing that you draped around yourself, tunics, not togas, those were purely ceremonial by this point in time, the trousers just looked strange. It wouldn't be better to have something that you don't have to buy a new pair of every 2 years as you expand in size. In addition to wearing these strange leggings, the hair of the Goths seemed odd. It was long, it was straggly, and some of it was on their face. Aside from the radical Julian the Apostate, Romans preferred to be clean-shaven, and they preferred short hair. Even worse, barbarians styled their hair by using rancid butter that you didn't want to use for cooking sometimes, which kept your hair in place, but gave off a very distinctive odor. And one snide Roman poet of the 5th century penned the immortal line, "Happy the nose that cannot smell a barbarian." In addition to putting strange substances in their hair that the Roman nose found offensive, the barbarians cooked in an odd fashion, which Romans remarked upon. They didn't fry everything in oil the way that a good Roman would do. Instead, they liked animal fat and butter, which were products available in Poland, but there were few olive trees in Poland. And they preferred to fry their food in these substances. Although they acquired a taste for wine, their preferred beverage is brown and noxious, beer, and made from grain. But perhaps worst of all, worse than their clothing or their cuisine, is the language spoken by the barbarians. They do not speak the beautiful, mellifluous Latin that Romans so prized. Instead, they speak the undeniably harsh and grating Germanic dialects, of which English is one horrible-sounding example. And indeed, the Roman term barbarian derives from the Roman conception of foreigners' speaking habits. To Roman ears, a Germanic conversation sounded like this: bar, 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 bar. It was unintelligible gibberish, but also very guttural. And so the term barbarian, the people who say barbar all the time, comes to be the label affixed by Romans to the Goths. They're barbarians, but they are useful. The Goths had performed military service on behalf of the empire before 376. They could be hired once again to defend the Roman frontier along the Danube and to prevent other people like themselves and perhaps prevent the Huns from crossing if it came to that. And so in 376, Emperor Valens, the emperor of the eastern half of the empire, most of the Danube frontier fell within his half of the empire, decided to agree to the request of the Goths and allows them to cross the frontier under certain conditions. Firstly, he will not permit all the Goths to enter because there are too many of them. He allows only some of the Goths to enter, and the rest are left on the other side of the Danube to the tender mercies of the Huns. As for the number that he permits to cross, reasonable estimates suggest 100,000 to 200,000 people. It's a sizable movement of human beings, but you should not imagine that there are millions and millions of Goths entering the Roman Empire. As a percentage of the overall Roman population, this is simply a drop in the bucket. In addition to limiting the number of Goths who are allowed into the empire, the emperor also requires that the Goths convert to Christianity, which they do within a few decades of entering, although they convert to Arianism rather to Catholicism, and this will cause problems in future lectures. And the Goths have to agree to perform military service for the empire. Valens requires the Goths to live close to the Danube and to provide soldiers who will guard the Danube frontier, and in return, the emperor will allow the refugees to enter the empire, and he will provide food for them and land to them until the Goths are able to establish themselves and provide their own food. It was, in theory, not a bad arrangement, something in it for everyone. But the arrangement broke down, and the blame needs to be placed on local Roman officials. The Roman sources agree with this. Local Roman officials who sought to make money from the predicament of the Goths, because they began to withhold the promised food supplies from the Goths, forcing Goths to pay exorbitant prices in return for the food, sometimes demanding that Goths agree to sell their own family members to the Romans as slaves before they would release the food shipments that had been sent by the emperor. When Goths protested that, enslaving ourselves had not been part of the original agreement, local Roman officials invited Gothic leaders to a dinner banquet at which we would discuss our differences about this issue. It was a trap, and the local Roman officials intended to kidnap the most important Goths and rob the Goths of their leadership, but some of the Goths managed to escape the ambush, and the outraged Goths began to rampage through the Balkans, and the Gothic migration, which had started out with peaceful intentions, now turned into a Gothic invasion, and Valens realized that he would have to throw the Goths back out again. In 378, Valens leads the Roman army against the Goths, and at the Battle of Adrianople suffers a devastating defeat. He is himself killed in battle against the Goths, who could notch up another Roman emperor, and as a result, the Goths were free to continue their rampage in the Balkans. However, they are not in a position to take over the whole of the Roman Empire by any means. And so after 4 years of continued fighting, a peace treaty is signed between the Goths and the Romans. In 382, the status quo of 376 is essentially restored. The Goths are to live just south of the Danube and perform military service on behalf of the Romans. The Romans will provide food shipments to the Goths. Still, the fact that the Romans had been unable to throw the Goths out of the empire after trying, and the fact that Valens himself was now dead as a result of agreeing to the Gothic migration of 376, these were not promising signs for the future. Attempts to keep Gothic-Roman relations calm, perhaps even pleasant, were undermined by two different forces. One was a Gothic leader by the name of Alaric, and the other was anti-barbarian sentiment that started to run very high after the death of Valens and the defeat at Adrianople in 378. Alaric was a Gothic leader who would make frequent demands upon the Roman government, both the government in the east and the government in the west, in an attempt to show his fellow Goths that he had clout with the Romans, that therefore they should accept him as their leader. He bombarded Roman emperors with demands for more food, with more money, and most insultingly, at least from the point of view of the Romans, he wanted to be made a general in the Roman army, and he wanted a fancy title. And the Roman emperors were willing to provide the food and the money, but they didn't want to give him the title that he was seeking. And Alaric would bolster his demands by sacking the occasional Roman town and burning it down to show that he meant business when he made these requests. As for anti-barbarian sentiment, it was running high both in the eastern half and in the western half of the Roman Empire. especially as Goths began to serve in the army and to assume positions of great prominence within the army, becoming generals and in fact commanders-in-chief in both the East and the West. The result of this animosity towards the barbarians was rioting and massacres of barbarians. In 400, in the city of Constantinople, a riot breaks out against Germans who are residing there, and barbarians are massacred. You did not want to wear trousers in Constantinople in 400. The same thing happened in Rome in 408, and the massacre of barbarians in Rome in 408 was going to set off a chain of events that would lead to the Gothic sack of Rome in 410. The riot in Rome in 408, the anti-barbarian massacres, were not really spontaneous outbreaks of resentment against the barbarians. They're actually carefully orchestrated by a group of Roman senators who had become very mistrustful of Alaric and had become very mistrustful of another barbarian by the name of Stilicho. Stilicho was commander-in-chief of the Roman army. And Roman senators were fearful that he and Alaric, since they're both barbarians, might come to terms, might join forces and take over the western half of the empire for themselves. Their fears seemed to be realized when in 407, Stilicho, as commander-in-chief of the Roman army, agreed to meet the demands of Alaric and to provide him with the generalship that Alaric had been demanding and to make regular cash payments to him. And Stilicho claimed that as commander-in-chief of the army, this was his prerogative to determine who would or would not be a general. Roman senators had Stilicho murdered and had as many barbarians as they and their followers could catch in the city of Rome, likewise executed. Those barbarians who escaped the massacres in Rome in 408 joined Alaric, who is outraged at the treatment of the barbarians. He's also outraged at the fact that the Roman senators would not abide by the agreement that he, Alaric, had reached with Stilicho. Alaric argued that Stilicho was commander-in-chief of the Roman army. He promised me a generalship, and therefore I should still be a general. Roman senators claimed that any agreement that you had with Stilicho died with Stilicho, and therefore the agreement is null and void, and you do not get to be a general in the Roman army. How to put pressure on the Roman government to follow through on this agreement. Alaric leads the Goths out of the Balkans and into Italy, and he besieges the city of Rome itself in 410, threatening to sack it, essentially holding it hostage. He will let it go only if the Roman government agrees to follow through on the agreement he had with the murdered Stilicho. The Roman government was not in Rome, however. It had not been in Rome very often since the 4th century. It was located at Ravenna at this moment in time, and therefore under no immediate threat. And therefore, despite pleas from the citizens of Rome to please give the man what he wants, safe in Ravenna, Roman government said, no, under no circumstances are we going to give in to this sort of blackmail. And so Alaric felt he had no choice but to follow through on his threats. And so he sacks the city of Rome in 410, rampaging through it for 3 days before storming off and heading out of Italy, north of the Alps, looking for something else to sack. The sack of Rome in 410 shocked contemporaries, as we mentioned in the last lecture. It had been almost 800 years since a foreign enemy had gone into Italy and done this to the Eternal City. On the other hand, we can appreciate now something that contemporaries did not fully appreciate, which is that the sack of Rome was not an uncomplicated expression of Gothic strength and Roman weakness, because Alaric would have preferred not to sack the city of Rome. No one ever wants to kill their hostages, after all. He would have preferred to have been made a general, and the only reason that he sacks the city of Rome is because he had been unable to browbeat the Roman government into acceding to his demands. And in a sense, the sack of Rome, therefore, is an expression of the continuing ability of Rome to resist the Goths and their demands. One might think that the Goths' sack of Rome was going to poison relations between the Romans and the Goths so badly that the two would not make any attempt to coexist. But that was not the case, because the Romans still felt some need for cooperation with the Goths, because events were quickly overtaking the Roman Empire. The winter of 406-407 was unusually cold in Europe, and the Roman defenses along the Rhine River had been stripped of soldiers who'd been brought back to Italy to deal with the possibility of a Gothic invasion. Barbarian groups living on the other side of the Rhine River, took advantage of the cold winter, which froze the Rhine over solidly, to walk across it, where they found the guardhouses are all empty. No one's watching the empire. And as a result, there's a massive movement of barbarian groups in 406, 407 across the Rhine, as new groups such as the Vandals decide to enter. The Romans, confronted with this latest wave of migrations into the empire, tried to ally with the Goths once again and to use the Goths to turn back the groups that had crossed over in the winter of 406, 407. And the result is yet another in the seemingly endless stream of treaties between the Goths and Romans. This one signed in 418, just 8 years after the sack of Rome. There is something new about the Treaty of 418, though, and it reflects the fact that while the Goths were not able to impose their will on the Romans entirely, nonetheless, they were gaining ground at the expense of the Romans. The agreement of 418 gave the Goths a great deal of leeway, and the treaty is very much to the advantage of the Goths. The Goths still have to provide military service to the Romans, but they are not settled right along the Roman frontier under terms of the Treaty of 418. Instead, they're settled in the south of France, which is very far from the Rhine-Danube frontier, but a very, very pleasant place to live. And occasionally they will be required to bestir themselves and travel to the Rhine River frontier. In addition to living on the Riviera, the Goths are now permitted to have a single ruler, a king, who can act as an intermediary between themselves and the Romans. In 376 and in 382, the Romans would not acknowledge a Gothic king because it would have created almost a Gothic state within a state for them to have their own ruler who was different from the Roman emperor. But by 418, the Romans feel they have no choice but to accept the existence of a single Gothic king. The Goths living in the south of France are to support themselves through tax revenues. Under the terms of the Treaty of 418, the Roman government allotted 1/3 of tax revenues collected from the region in which they settled to the use of the Goths, and the granting of 1/3 of local tax revenues and the settling of barbarians in a region where they can collect the taxes was known by the technical term of hospitalitas, or hospitality. The right to siphon off 1/3 of local tax revenue was rather generous of the Romans and helped to make the Goths far wealthier than they had been before. But the Romans were unstable allies, and while they allied with the Goths in 418, their real policy was to try and play different barbarian groups off of one another. Was one group strong, you would ally with another one and try and turn that barbarian group against whoever seemed to be in the ascendant. For example, in the 430s and the 440s, despite their treaty with the Goths of 418, the Romans recruited among the Huns and put together armies that they used to harass the Goths. But when the Huns break into the empire in 451, the Romans switch sides almost immediately and try and recruit among the Goths to get them to fight against the Huns. After the settlement of the Goths in southern Gaul and the entrance of the Vandals and other barbarian groups in 406, 407, the subsequent history of various barbarian groups within the empire becomes extremely complicated. Suffice it to say that the Roman Empire, during the course of the 5th century, began to contract in size. It began to abandon outlying areas and to concentrate its forces on the vital center, on Italy itself, abandoning provinces, some of which had been held by the Roman Empire for a very long time. For example, the Roman army pulled out of England, never to return around 409. In Spain, the Roman army leaves in 411 and never returns in any substantial force. And the Roman army is even withdrawn from North Africa in 432. The western half of the empire is starting to shrink considerably. And the policy of playing different barbarian groups off of one another, recruiting one group to fight against another group, was not sufficient to save Rome from a second sack. The Huns, under their leader Attila, approached the city of Rome in 452 and nearly sacked the city. Attila's death prevented that from happening. A different group, the Vandals, do sack Rome in 455, the second sack of Rome to occur within a matter of decades. It was becoming increasingly clear to barbarian rulers that the Roman Empire was not in charge anymore, that they themselves were in charge, since they were doing all the fighting on behalf of the Romans. And the Goths began to act with increasing independence from the Romans. Already during the 460s and the 470s, the Goths seized much of southern France, areas that had not been allotted to them by the Treaty of 418. They began to expand to the southwest and take over parts of Spain, and they established what is essentially their own independent kingdom and throw off any sort of overlordship that Roman emperors might have claimed. And they referred to this kingdom as the Kingdom of Toulouse because they made the town of Toulouse in southwest France their capital. The success of the Goths and their establishment of an independent kingdom right within the western half of the Roman Empire inspired envy on the part of either other barbarian leaders who began to realize that the western half of the empire is now up for grabs and we need to start carving out territories for ourselves. And as a result, you start to find the fragmentation of areas that had been nominally Roman. One of such barbarian ruler was someone by the name of Odoacer. Sometimes his name is spelled as Odovaker. Odovaker came from a relatively minor barbarian tribe known as the Siri. They were not very numerous. And he did not have a large following of his own. But despite this fact, Odovaker was going to do something that even the Gothic rulers had never dared to do. Odovaker decided in 476 that the only way he could gain control of Italy and create a kingdom to rival that of the Goths centered on southwestern France and Spain was to depose the last emperor in the West. The emperor in the West is sent into a comfortable retirement. He doesn't kill him. He simply sends him to a villa and says, don't leave, whatever you do, and assumes rulership in Italy. It is worth noting that Odovaker did not assume the imperial title himself. Despite the fact that he deposed the last Roman emperor in the West, he knew that assuming the imperial title would have been very insulting to the Roman inhabitants of the empire because it would have been placing himself on the same level as a Roman emperor. It would have been very insulting to the emperor in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, who might very well have come and attacked Odovaker right away. And as a sign of his humility in these matters, he took the imperial regalia from the last Roman emperor in the West, and he sends them to Constantinople as a gesture of peace and to show that I am not claiming to be your equal. The only title that he takes for himself is Rex, or king, the same title that is used by other barbarian rulers. But despite the fact that he will not take the imperial title for himself and that the imperial title will not be used by anyone in the West again until Charlemagne revives it in 800 AD, he had ended the Roman Empire in the West, at least when conceived of as a political unit, because once the last emperor was gone, the only thing left on the ground were independent barbarian kingdoms ruled over by Germans, such as Odovaker himself. To conclude, the western half of the Roman Empire, as a political unit, formally comes to an end in 476 AD, and this is the result of a chain of events set in motion by the Gothic migration of 376 AD. The Goths and the other Germanic barbarians who followed in their wake had no intention of destroying the Roman Empire. They are coming as immigrants, and in the case of the Goths, they are simply looking to get away from the Huns. They rather liked the Roman way of living and wanted to enjoy the same standards of living that the Romans enjoyed. However, relations broke down between the Germanic Goths and other barbarian groups and the Romans. And as a consequence of this breakdown in relations, barbarians succeeded in carving out their own independent kingdoms. In a sense, the fall of the Roman Empire is very simple, if one chooses to equate it with the deposing of the last Roman emperor in 476. However, in many senses, Rome did not end in 476. In some parts of the empire, Roman civilization had totally collapsed long before 476. And in some parts of the western half of the Roman Empire, Roman civilization was going to persist long after 476. And considering the different barbarian kingdoms that emerged during this period and the extent of Roman continuity or discontinuity within those kingdoms, consideration of this will considerably complicate our notion of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And in the next few lectures, we're going to examine these barbarian kingdoms and the issue of continuity and discontinuity with the Roman past.